Mentioning my previous experiences with a corrupt judiciary in Germany, I address my letter of March 15, 2021 to the Munich public prosecutor with the following request. The above descriptions give strong reason to assume that the business data of Wirecard Act contains large amounts of laundered protection money extorted on the black market by parts of the German judiciary. My intention is to expose this systematic corruption. As you may notice, based on my knowledge and skills, I am perfectly able to locate the accused groups within Wirecard Act's database. If I had succeeded in doing so, it can be made credible that the said conviction was intended to give emphasis to the extortion of protection money that had once failed, and that the sentence by the judiciary in Fulda had been intended to blackmail me for paying protection money. I therefore ask you to provide me with the business data or copies of the data records of the Wirecard business. The letter remains unanswered. Also on March 15, 2021, citing my letter to the Munich Public Prosecutor's Office, I am asking for support from the Bavarian Ministry of Justice. I am writing this to you in search for support. Of course, the Bavarian Judiciary, and thus also the Munich Public Prosecutor's Office, are not excluded from the suspicion of blackmailing and money laundering at Wirecard Act. It must therefore be assumed that the Munich Public Prosecutor's Office will refuse to hand over copies of the business data to me for analysis in order to protect their own colleagues. Please contact the Public Prosecutor's Office in Munich using the file number given and ask them to make the data accessible to me. I am very grateful to you for your support. The letter remains unanswered. Not only the Wambach report on the auditing company Ernst & Young remained secret from the public, my letters to the Munich Public Prosecutor and the Bavarian Ministry of Justice give you an idea of what information the members of the Bundestag Investigative Committee received from the secret services about the Wirecard affair. Unsurprisingly, I can't find anything about this in the committee's report, so one must emphatically point this out to the ladies and gentlemen. Also on March 15, 2021, the Bundestag Investigative Committee received these two letters. In doing so, I was pursuing the goal of putting pressure on the committee not to come up with the idea of leaving the money launderers at Wirecard anonymous. I also point out the problems that come with outsourcing business-critical business units. This is also an issue that the BaFin should have noticed during its audits of the Wirecard Bank when it came to assessing the group as a financial holding company. By that occasion, I point out that I am interested in the opaque SEPA system. When I was looking for Wirecard's business data, I failed quite early on with SEPA. The SEPA has hidden itself so well under the shelter of the DSGV that despite my good specialist knowledge, I could not nail this shop to the wall in the tangle of European regulations. The SEPA office at the DSGV is a dead end, so I would not be able to get the transfer data of the money launderers this way. The spectacle of the career politicians began as soon as the investigative committee of the German parliament had dissolved itself. They wanted to use the Wirecard-Scandal as a career springboard by pushing themselves to the fore. On November 17, 2021, I am writing to the Finance Minister of Baden-Württemberg, Mr. Bayas. Your recent promotion to Finance Minister of the Federal State of Baden-Württemberg is certainly not due to your excellent suitability for this post or any other merit. It must be assumed that you received this post as a form of hush money for your tolerance of Wirecard's money launderers. Your double standards of obstructing the investigation of money laundering at Wirecard, and as Finance Minister of Baden-Württemberg, calling on the population to denounce taxes evasion, is another indication of your moral depravity. I hereby call on you to give up your position as Minister of Finance in Baden-Württemberg and to disclose your information on money laundering at Wirecard. Mr. Bayas has not resigned from his post, nor has he replied to this letter. The phenomenon of a lightning career after the investigation committee on Wirecard should not be limited to Mr. Bayas. The prominent actors Tonkar and Kitsiltep were also able to sell themselves for their silence a short time later. On January 24, 2022, I address myself to the Federal Minister of Finance and inform me. In the attachment, I am also sending you my letter of November 17, 2021 to the Minister of Finance of Baden-Württemberg, Mr. Bayas. Just like your colleague Mr. Tonkar, Mr. Bayas pushed himself boldly to the fore during his work for the Investigative Committee of the German Parliament and tried to make a name for himself in public as a spotter. As can be seen from the report of the Investigative Committee of the German Parliament, the committee did not use my information and, despite an explicit request, made no contribution to the clarification of money laundering at Wirecard. Mr. Bayas apparently received his post as finance minister as hush money and not for his services in clearing up the Wirecard scandal. At least money laundering at Wirecard has so far remained unsolved. This must now take place at European level. Also on November 17, 2021, I wrote to your party colleague, Mr. Frank Schaffler. See attachment. In the message, I informed Mr. Schaffler that I would also demand Mr. Tonkar's resignation if he also received hush money in the form of a post. Now that this fear has been realized, I urge you to remove Mr. Tonkar from his post. Mr. Tonkar has not been recalled from his post, nor has the Minister of Finance replied to this letter. On April 16, 2022, I am writing to the Federal Minister for Housing, Urban Development and Construction. Attached you will find my letter to the Minister of Finance of Baden-Württemberg dated November 17, 2021. In it, I call on Mr. Bayas to resign from his post. In my letter dated January 24, 2022, I am asking the Federal Finance Minister Lindner to also dismiss his State Secretary Tonkar. The investigative committee had to take note that Wirecard was primarily abused for money laundering by people who were unable to launder their black money abroad, since the German federal government would be exposed to be blackmailed by such states. Mr. Tonkar and Bayas appropriated the knowledge of this group of politicians, prosecutors, judges, and police officers in order to blackmail a political career, or they received their posts as hush money. This obviously also applies to your Undersecretary of State, Mrs. Kiziltepe. I therefore call on you to remove Mrs. Kiziltepe from her post. Mrs. Kiziltepe has not been recalled from her post, nor has the Federal Minister for Building replied to this letter. On May 16, 2022, I am writing to the Federal Minister for Family Affairs, Senior Citizens, Women and Youth, Mrs. Lisa Paz. In contrast to your colleagues, Kiziltepe, Bayas, and Tonkar, you are not suspected of using your knowledge of money launderers at Wirecard as a means of exerting pressure to blackmail yourself into political office, since you did not take office immediately, as was the case with your colleagues. Nevertheless, no politician who encourages corruption and money laundering can remain in office. I therefore call on you to resign from your post as Federal Minister immediately. Mrs. Paz is still in office. The letter remains unanswered. After the Wirecard Investigative Committee, Mr. Demasi withdrew from politics, gave up his mandate at the German Parliament, and resigned from his party. It is also obvious, because this was already insignificant in 2022, so that he could not claim a post for his silence about the money launderers at Wirecard. In the meantime, Mr. Demasi has spoken up again and sold himself as an expert for Wirecard. On July 20, 2023, shortly after The Sign of Life from Jan Marsalek appeared on July 18, 2023, Mr. Demasi assumes it as conceivable that money was laundered at Wirecard. On December 8, 2022, however, he was still certain that money was being laundered at Wirecard. After Jan Marsalek presented the court with evidence of the existence of the third-party business, Mr. Demasi doubted on Jan Marsalek's credibility on August 10, 2023. Is Mr. Demasi aware of the content of Jan Marsalek's letter to the court? Contrary to the other prominent actors, Mr. Demasi was unable to gain any personal advantage from the Wirecard Investigative Committee. Now this turncoat and self-declared financial expert sells himself as an investigative journalist. This begs the question, how does he actually fund this work? If he really wanted to uncover money laundering at Wirecard and share his knowledge from the investigative committee with the public, he would probably have the same fate as me, and he would have to flee Germany. The suspicion arises that Mr. De Masi sells himself as an alibi provider, intending not to leave empty-handed. Mr. De Masi's suspicious behavior raises the question of whether the money launderers were moved by the board of directors into the third-party business in order to keep it as far away from the company as possible. To do this, you would have identified the money launderers in the business data prior to that. Not only that makes strategic business sense, it would also explain why the public prosecutor and the judge in the proceedings against the board members of Wirecard AG refused to believe in the existence of third-party business. Wirecard's bankruptcy is not due to falsified balance sheets, but due to the money that has disappeared from the trust accounts. The money launderers themselves will probably not publicly complain about the missing money. It is also obvious to doubt its existence, especially if you fear that you would find your own name or that of your colleagues in there. I am addressing the Whistleblower Network Association with my letter dated June 30, 2023, and refer to the approval of the Whistleblower Network Association for the implementation of Regulation EU 2019/1937 into national German law. In my letter, the association is asked to withdraw its consent to the Whistleblower Protection Act with retrospective effect. It has been in force since May 31, 2023. I noted that the law does not provide effective protection against repression because this law only addresses whistleblowers who are in an employment relationship. Since it was clear to me from the start that I would be on my own with my revelations and that these interest groups are only political filters and alibi providers, it was not surprising that no one answered to me.